Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Before we begin, we would like to inform you that we shall be holding another round of our National Scholarship Test on the 8th of August, that is on the coming Sunday at 10 a.m. This would be an opportunity for IAS aspirants to win attractive scholarships for our UPSC courses. And you can register for this scholarship test by using the link that would be provided in the description box below. And also note that the registration for this test closes on the 7th of August, that is on Saturday at 10 a.m. So those who are interested, please register yourselves before the deadline to test your skills through the Byju's National Scholarship Test and as well as to win attractive scholarships. With this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 7 of the Delhi edition. This column is written by Mr. Krishnan Srinivasan, a former Foreign Secretary of India, and he evaluates the nature of federalism found in the Union of India and as well as in the European Union. See, as you might know, India is a federation. The very first article of the Constitution states that India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. Even though the Constitution displays a unitary bias, and even though technically India is a quasi-federal state, it is essentially a federation formed by the union of states. So while India is a national level federation, the European Union, on the other hand, is a supranational organization because it brings together 27 different countries of Europe to form one of the world's most successful unions. And in its structure, you find both confederal and federal features. See, a confederal structure or a confederation is nothing but a voluntary union of states. Under a confederation, different units or different states come together voluntarily to form a strong union like the European Union, and even the United States of America was a confederation before 1788. On the other hand, in a federation, membership is not voluntary. For example, in federations like India, leaving the union is not an option. So apart from this basic difference between a confederation and a federation, there are several other differences as well on the grounds of sovereignty, the extent of central authority, and the extent of power that is given to the constituent states. So on this basis, the writer says that the European Union has a mix of confederal and federal features in its structure, but it is essentially a union of 27 states. Whereas India, on the other hand, is just a federation with a unitary bias, and it is a union of states where the states do not have the rights or the powers to secede from the union. So, in some ways, the Union of India and the European Union are similar, yet they are so different. But the point that the writer is trying to make is that both the unions are facing a threat to their federation or to their respective unions as a result of clash of cultures. As the union of different states brings together diversity of cultures, the union or the central authority tries to homogenize the cultural identity for the sake of unity or values. But this homogenizing tendency of the center or of the union results in clashes with the particularism that is unique to each state or to each federated unit. The European Union is facing one such internal crisis. Even though the supranational organization has formed a strong union, it is also facing an internal crisis due to bickering and fights amongst the states. The 27 states of the European Union have been fighting internally over several policies, including trade, fisheries, budgetary allocation, etc. The Brexit process was a clear illustration of these internal conflicts within the Union, and it also highlights the internal cultural differences amongst each states that constitute the Union. On similar lines, the European Union has been facing a clash between its organizational values and the domestic values of each state, which is threatening the very foundation of the Union. See, the European Union as an organization is largely inspired by Western liberal thought, and at its core, it has adopted progressive values and principles that are rooted in democratic principles, human rights, and non discrimination on the grounds of gender, ethnicity, or race. So the European Union expects the states to strictly uphold these organizational values and principles at any cost. And this, in a way, is an attempt of the European Union to homogenize the cultural identity of the European region. And this leads to a clash with the domestic values of individual states. Recently, European Union members such as Hungary and Poland have run into trouble with the organization because of their domestic policies, which are seen to be against the LGBTQ community. The governments of these countries, which are headed by authoritative leaders with autocratic tendencies, are trying to please their domestic vote bank, and for this, they are relying upon orthodox religion and outdated religious views, which takes a stand against homosexuality and against the rights of homosexuals. Hungary has recently brought out a law that openly discriminates against the LGBTQ community, and a similar stance has been taken by the conservative ruling party in Poland. These controversial laws and policies of Hungary and Poland are completely contradictory to the liberal thoughts, values, and principles of the European Union. So, as a result, the other liberal states of the European Union have targeted countries like Hungary through the European Parliament, which is one of the principal organs of the EU, and have even dragged Hungary to the European Court of Justice over this controversial law. There have even been instances where, along with Hungary and Poland, Slovenia is also known to come out with such policies which constantly weakens and erodes democratic norms in their countries. And their policies not only target LGBTQ minorities, but they have even been designed to weaken judicial independence, which in fact is a bedrock principle in any democracy. So, as these members of the European Union are openly violating the principles and values of the Union, a few leading members of the grouping are considering a legal mechanism through which these members could be expelled from the Union itself. So, the point that the writer is trying to make is that in any such union or in any federation setup, if there is an attempt by the Union to homogenize the cultural identity, it will result in clashes with the particular values that are specific and unique to each constituent state. Then the writer goes on to compare this with the Union of India. Within the Indian Federation as well, a similar clash of cultures can be noticed, especially between the center and opposition controlled states. It's quite common for the center to misuse the unitary bias in the Indian constitution to weaken and target opposition controlled states, especially to target the state governments. Be it the questionable implementation of President's rule under Article 356, or be it the related misuse of the governor's office. Then we have even seen discrimination with regard to fund allocation and allocation of resources to states, and also the misuse of central investigating agencies such as CBI, IT Department, Enforcement Directorate, etc., to target opposition parties at the state level. We have even seen widespread misuse of the surveillance capabilities of the center to fulfill political agendas at the state level. This practice of center misusing its powers to target state governments has been going on since the days of Prime Minister Nehru and continues till date under the rule of Prime Minister Modi. Successive central governments are known to misuse their powers, and in their attempt to create a homogeneous cultural identity for the center of the union, they often politically target the states. And this, according to the writer, is a different instance of the homogeneous bias of the union clashing with the particularism that is unique to each state. Even though the two examples that have been taken by the writer are in different contexts, his underlying point is that in a federation, if the union displays a homogeneous bias, then it will clash with the particularism of different states, thereby threatening the very unity of the federation. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 that deals with the topic of right to strike. In this column, the writer, who's a senior IPS officer from Chhattisgarh, evaluates the rights of essential workers such as government employees, employees of defense organizations and security forces, to carry out strikes by abandoning work in order to raise their grievances and collectively bargain against their respective employers. See, it has been very well established that right to strike is not a fundamental right. One might argue that right to strike constitutes an essential fundamental right under freedom of expression, which is guaranteed under Article 19. Yes, under Article 19, the fundamental right to freedom of expression includes the right to form an association and the right to protest. But this fundamental right does not extend to carrying out strikes, and this has been made very clear by the Supreme Court in the T.K. Rangarajan case of 2003. So, be it a regular civilian worker or a government employee or a defense employee, none of them enjoy the fundamental right to strike. But however, right to strike has been recognized only as a legal right or as a statutory right under Section 22, Clause 1, Subclause A of the Industrial Disputes Act of 1947. This legal right extends to the right to carry out a peaceful strike through which employees of an organization and the workers can air their grievances against the employer, thus increasing their collective bargaining power. But even this right has been restricted for public utilities which serve a public purpose, and further restrictions have been introduced against the legal right to strike through the new Industrial Relations Code which was enacted last year. So here it's very important to understand the availability of this legal right for civilian workers and the availability of this right for defense employees, government employees and security forces. While right to strike is not a fundamental right for all types of workers, right to strike as a legal right is available only to civilian workers. This legal right has been largely restricted for government employees, defense employees and security forces, and the writer is specifically focused on this. That's because this topic is in news as the Ministry of Defense has recently introduced the Essential Defense Services Bill 2021 in the Lok Sabha. Through this bill, the Ministry of Defense is seeking to classify all workers and employees in defense organizations as essential workers who are part of essential defense services. And through this, it prohibits their right to strike and declares it as illegal. This bill has been introduced by the government to specifically deal with the threat of protests and strikes by employees of ordnance factory boards who have opposed the reforms proposed to the ordnance factory boards. The ordnance factory boards, which are public sector units, play a critical role in the defense industry as they supply essential ammunition and equipment to the armed forces and the security forces. To make these factories more efficient, the government is seeking to modernize them and introduce reforms. And one of the key proposed reform is to corporatize the ordnance factory boards. But the workers and the employees have opposed these proposed reforms and they have threatened to go on strike against the government in order to protest against these reforms. So to preempt any such strike by the employees and workers of ordnance factory boards, the Ministry of Defense has brought in a bill that prohibits their right to strike even as a legal right and declares it as illegal. The government and the parliament can do this and restrict this right on the grounds of national security and on the grounds of threat to life and property of the public. The writer argues that this is the correct step by the government and the parliament because essential workers such as defense workers, government employees and members of armed forces and security forces, they cannot go on strike as it not only threatens the security of the state and the stability of the government, but it could also result in unjustifiable chaos and as well as violent disturbances to public order. In fact, this is not the first time that the right of government employees to carry out strike has been curbed by the state. Back in 1965, Madhya Pradesh became one of the first states to introduce civil service rules under which the right of government employees to carry out strike was completely prohibited. In fact, even the Constitution of India under Article 33 empowers the Parliament to completely restrict or even abrogate fundamental rights that are available to security forces and armed forces. This position has been upheld by the Supreme Court as well in the Delhi police case of 1986, where it held that the right of police officers and officers of the armed forces to form associations and to carry out protests and strikes has been restricted, and this is a reasonable restriction on the fundamental rights that are available to them. So, if this is the case, then how do government employees and workers in defense organizations and members of armed forces and security forces, how do they raise their grievances? According to the writer, the only viable option for them is to raise their complaints and their voices through internal process that exists, or to approach respective tribunals such as Central Administrative Tribunal or the judiciary. While these routes are available to government employees and defense employees, they cannot resort to strike at any cost, according to the writer, not just because right to strike is not a fundamental right, but mainly because their work constitutes essential defense services and essential services, which is critical for the security of the state and as well as for public order. Despite this, if government employees and defense workers are threatening to go on strike, then the government and the parliament are empowered to entirely curb these rights and even declare them as illegal. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 in which the writer explains the concept behind mRNA technology, which is the foundation upon which several vaccines against COVID-19 have been developed, thus marking a major breakthrough in the field of biomedicine. First, the writer goes on to acknowledge the role of women in leading the development of most of the COVID-19 vaccines. She points out the role of leading women scientists around the world in the development of most of the popular COVID-19 vaccines. For example, it was Sarah Gilbert who played a lead role at the University of Oxford in the development of AstraZeneca's Covishield. Similarly, in India, it was K. Sumati who led Bharat Biotech's Covaxin initiative that helped India develop its indigenous vaccine. Then even the vaccines developed by Johnson & Johnson and Sputnik have been based on research that was led by women scientists. But the writer specifically focuses on Dr. Kathleen Carrico, who played a stellar role in the harnessing of mRNA technology for the first time ever. This technology has been hailed as groundbreaking and revolutionary in the field of biotechnology and biomedicine, and some of the most popular and effective vaccines against COVID-19, such as Pfizer BioNTech and Moderna's vaccines, are based on this mRNA technology that was conceptualized, designed, and developed by Dr. Kathleen Carrico. See, mRNA stands for messenger RNA. See, RNA or ribonucleic acid is a biological macromolecule that is present in all biological cells. It is primarily involved in the synthesis of proteins, carrying the messenger instructions from DNA, which itself contains the genetic instructions required for the development and maintenance of life. Under this, we have mRNA or messenger RNA, which play a critical role in protein synthesis. This mRNA is a naturally occurring molecule in animal cells, and as the name itself indicates, it carries signals or messages, which is essentially genetic information, to various animal cells, which tells the cells as to which proteins have to be synthesized. So essentially, mRNA tells the animal cells as to which proteins have to be synthesized and made. Without mRNA, your genetic code would never get used by your body. Without mRNA, proteins would never be made, and your body wouldn't be able to carry out any of the essential functions. So mRNAs are absolutely critical with regard to physiological functions because it entirely depends upon protein synthesis. So through the groundbreaking research of Dr. Kathleen Carrico, today it is possible to engineer these mRNAs to carry specific customized signals to animal cells, which in turn will signal them or message them to manufacture or synthesize specific proteins. So through this technology, we can tell animal cells by sending customized signals through mRNA as to which precise antibodies will have to be made by the animal cells against specific antigens or disease-causing microbes. This essentially allows researchers to develop an entirely new category of medicines, drugs, and vaccines through which several untreatable diseases can also be cured and treated. That's the reason why this technology is being labeled as path breaking technology in the field of biomedicine, and it essentially allows humans to play God by interfering with the transmission of genetic information. This path-breaking technology was adopted by BioNTech, which provided Dr. Katalin Kariko an opportunity to conduct her research and prove her theory, which was later adopted by these pharmaceutical companies to develop their respective COVID-19 vaccines. The writer further goes on to illustrate the inspiring story of Dr. Katalin Kariko and documents her struggles in the development of this path-breaking technology. But from an examination point of view, what would be relevant is the concept behind mRNA technology and how it helps in developing specific drugs and vaccines that can help us fight against untreatable diseases. Next, on page number 6, we have a column written by the Vice President of India, Venkaiah Naidu. In this article, he makes a case for the introduction of professional courses in higher education that are offered in regional languages. He appreciates the recent decision of around 14 engineering colleges to introduce professional courses in regional languages, and he says that this is in line with the principles that are envisioned under the new education policy. The Vice President points out that there are several studies around the world, including those led by UNESCO, that have proven that students display better learning outcomes when they study in their native languages or in their mother tongue as compared to being taught in alien languages. In fact, offering such professional courses in regional languages is a global practice as well. Advanced countries like Germany, South Korea, and even China, they all offer their professional courses in regional languages, which helps the students learn in their native languages and in their mother tongue. According to the Vice President, this practice is not exclusivist, as it is not seeking to promote linguistic superiority. Instead, this would be an inclusive policy which offers an opportunity for students, particularly from the rural areas, to study in their native languages or in their mother tongues. Until now, one of the biggest roadblocks for rural students was the mandatory need to study in alien languages, which was significantly hampering their learning outcomes. So the Vice President hopes that with such introduction of professional courses in higher education, which use regional languages as a medium of instruction, we can hope to fulfill the dreams of rural students who are currently facing a language roadblock in their education. Now let's look at this article from page number 10. 50% funds allotted for ongoing MP-LADS projects have lapsed. See, MP-LADS stands for Members of Parliament Local Area Development Scheme. This scheme was launched in 1993 to enable MPs to recommend developmental work in their constituencies in order to create durable community assets which will have a long-lasting impact. This scheme is implemented by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, and these funds allotted to each MP is directly transferred to the district authorities, and the respective MPs will have the powers to authorize release of these funds for specific projects in their constituencies that help in creating durable community assets. Under this scheme, Lok Sabha MPs can utilize the funds in their respective constituencies. Then members of Rajya Sabha, they can recommend works in one or more districts in the state from where they have been elected. And as far as nominated MPs are concerned, that is both the nominated members of Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, they may select any one or more districts from any state in the country for implementation of their choice of work under the scheme. Currently under the scheme, 5 crore rupees per annum is allotted by the centre to each MP and to each constituency, and these funds do not lapse, and those funds that are not released by the government in a particular year, they even carry forward. But after the pandemic broke out, the government suspended MP-LAD scheme and decided to divert these funds for the management of the pandemic. But the suspension of the scheme had affected several ongoing projects, and hence the MPs had requested the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance to convince the government and the Finance Ministry to release these funds in order to complete the ongoing projects. As per this demand of the MPs, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance took up the matter with the Finance Ministry, and on the very same day, the pending amount was approved by the Department of Expenditure of the Finance Ministry. But shockingly, the Finance Ministry gave just 1 week's notice to the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation to transfer these funds to the district authorities. So after this deadline, the funds would lapse, and owing to this tight deadline, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation has been able to transfer and allot only a part of these allotted funds. The rest of the funds have lapsed, which is nearly 50% of the funds that were allotted for the ongoing projects, and hence, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance has strongly criticized the Finance Ministry for this policy lapse on its part. Now let's look at another article from page number 10. RTE entitlements to be paid through cash transfers under the Samagra Shiksha scheme. See, the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan was launched by the Government of India after it was proposed in the Union Budget of 2018-19. This is an ambitious overarching program for school education, and its coverage extends from preschool all the way up to class 12. This overarching scheme essentially subsumed three erstwhile schemes, including the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, the Rashtriya Madhyamik Shiksha Abhiyan, and Teachers Education. These three schemes were merged under the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, and it covers lakhs of government and aided schools with a reach of more than 15 crore students. The funding under the scheme is shared between the center and the states in the ratio of 60:40, and in order to make the center's contribution more effective, it has decided to pay the students for their right to education entitlements in the form of direct cash transfers. The center has approved an extension of the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan until March 2026, and until then, the RTE entitlements such as textbooks, uniforms, and transport allowance, this would be directly paid to the students in the form of direct cash transfers under the DBT model. It is still not clear whether the government would pay the tuition fees as well for students in the economically weaker sections category. But however, for the other entitlements such as textbooks, uniforms, and transport allowance, the entitlements would be directly paid by the center through the direct benefit transfer scheme, including the stipend that is provided for children with special needs. Now let's look at this article from page number 14. CERT-In, or the Indian Computer Emergency Response Team, has informed the Lok Sabha that it has tracked more than 6 lakh cybersecurity incidents that originated from countries around the world which were seeking to target computers in the Indian cyberspace. So this gives us an opportunity to talk about CERT-In. See, CERT-In, or Computer Emergency Response Team India, was established in 2004 under the provisions of Section 70B of the Information Technology Act of 2000. This organization has been set up under the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, and it has been designated as the National Nodal Agency for responding to all computer security incidents on the Indian cyberspace. Its main function is to provide early warning and effective incident response when the Indian cyberspace comes under attack, and as a part of this mandate, CERT-In runs a national watch and alert system that functions 24/7 and constantly scans the Indian cyberspace for any potential cybersecurity threats. Under the IT Act, CERT-In has been designated to perform the following functions, which includes collection, analysis, and dissemination of information on cybersecurity incidents, forecasting and sending out alerts related to cybersecurity incidents, implementing emergency measures, including response for handling cybersecurity incidents, coordinating with all the other concerned stakeholders, including intelligence agencies, defense agencies, private sector, and concerned government departments and agencies. For this purpose, the National Cyber Coordination Center has also been set up under CERT-In. Then finally, CERT-In is also responsible for issuing guidelines, advisories, and for communicating cybersecurity threats with all the stakeholders, including the common public. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: the nature of division of powers in India and the European Union brings the unions into conflict with their constituent parts. Analyze. The second question: write a detailed note on right to strike in the Indian context with focus on essential workers and security forces. Kindly write your answers and post them on the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.